Okay, are we live?
Yes, we're good to go.
Okay. Well, hi everyone and welcome to today's presentation on OLLI of Historic Secrets or the Stories of Your Life. So let me tell you what we really hope to do today. Number one, have some fun, maybe learn something, may even be inspired to do a little historical notations on yourself. But there are a couple of requirements beforehand before you do anything else, because we are here to have fun. So I want you to take your desk, whether it's your mental desk or the desk in front of you, find all the political junk and scoot it off to the side and throw it on the floor. On the other side of your desk, grab everything that has to do with pandemic, scoot it off and throw it on the floor. We don't want anything interfering with us because we're here today to have a good time. We're here today to talk about some of the best secrets in the world, secrets that have never been told. We're not going to ask you to talk about the real life of Uncle Frank, or did you know what so-and-so did last summer? We're not going to do those kind of secrets. We're going to talk about the secrets of our lives, secrets that we've never planned really to be secret. It's just that we think, well, you know, who would want to know about me? And we look around, we look here, and we see a little postage stamp size picture of the people here and say, well, you know, we all, what's different about me? And we do, we have a lot in common. One way or another, we're all associated with Texas Tech. Most of us, I think, or all of us today are in Texas. We do have an awful lot in common, but we are all separate individuals with our own stories. So I hold up one finger here, the correct finger, to remind you that everyone is different. So I was a cop for a long time. We all have different fingerprints. However many of us there are, we're all a unique individual. We all have our own lives, much of which our family and our friends know, and a lot of which they don't know. Now there on the screen, I hope you can read it all, is Albert Einstein. And I love that. Imagination is more important than knowledge. And today I really want you to, certainly have to maintain our intellect, our factual knowledge, but let our imagination kind of float free. So I don't have a whole lot in common with Albert Einstein. For sure, I go to a different barber. He is a great brain, great theoretician, physics, E equals MC squared. And that's about the facts that I know about him. Now, all of us have a history, and I'm not here to talk about my personal history, but we're going to talk about our personal history. I was a cop for a long, long time, and I don't know which came first, the chicken or the egg. Something I always enjoyed was solving a mystery. And of course, what we're talking about is we don't really intend our lives to be a mystery or a secret, but so much of our lives are. And of course, as a cop, I was always interested in the mystery. You know, who embezzled the $500,000 from the furniture store that caused it to go bankrupt? Who murdered the store clerk at 2 o'clock in the morning? Solve the mystery, find the secret, find who it was. But if I say I don't know whether it came first, the chicken or the egg, it's the enjoyment of solving a mystery. Now, when I was little, and I was born shortly before the start of World War II, obviously we didn't have television. We did have a radio, and I suspect many of you, if you're of our generation or close to it, we had one radio in the living room, and there are certain programs that we listened to every week. And you can almost picture this out of the old black and white movies. Mother and father sitting on the couch or the chair, and the kids sitting on the floor, listening to the programming. And if we weren't watching or listening to the radio, we read. And for you educators out there, I just can't say enough about reading. It is critical to livelihood. But we read, we didn't have a whole lot of money, we didn't have a whole lot of books. And I was, most of this time I was too little to even read. But my parents or my brothers or sister, we had 4 boys in the family and 1 girl, Beverly. Poor Beverly, having put up with 4 brothers. But when I was little, they would read to me. Now, I always remember, maybe it wasn't the first mystery, but the one that rang a bell with me most deeply was who killed Cockrobin. Now, you think politics today are ugly and dirty. Politics have been ugly and dirty since forever. Who Killed Cockrobin was written in 1744. Political parody, satire. Show of hands, does anybody know who killed Cockrobin and how Cockrobin was killed? Anybody know? Linda's shaking her head. Candace is looking like, not I. No? Okay. Who killed Cockrobin? It was the sparrow with the arrow killed Cockrobin. And as a little kid, and somebody reading that story to me, I was so excited because I could memorize it. It rhymed, the sparrow with the arrow. Who killed Cockrobin? You'll love the name of this whole book that it's from. It's Tommy Thumb's Pretty Little Songbook, written in 1744. And as far as I know, the author is unidentified. But that's when, I guess, the first time I ever enjoyed a mystery was reading Tommy Thumb's Pretty Little Songbook. But then along came 1950. I don't know about your family, but our family got a television set. The screen is probably smaller than this monitor I'm looking at right now, the monitor I'm looking at you with. What's My Line came on in 1950, lasted 17 years to 1967. And you may remember by name some of the panelists on there. During the 17 years, they've had close to 100 different panelists on there. Arlene Francis, Bennett Cerf, Dorothy Kilgallen, Steve Allen, the name goes on and on and on. The storyline of the program was the guest would be there with a profession or a vocation, and basically like true and false, yes and no questions. They would ask questions, try and narrow down what was that person's line, what did they do? But it lasted 17 years. And then along came 2 years later, 1952, I've Got a Secret. Does anybody remember that? Gary Moore, brought to you by Winston Cigarettes. And I never smoked at Winston, I guess, but at one time I did smoke cigarettes. But again, it was the same thing of, it was a mystery. The person would be sitting there in this little black and white TV set, they'd be there and the panelists would be there and they're asking questions, trying to determine what that person's secret is. Now, I want to back up here for a second. Keep in mind, I was a young cop in the 60s, started in 61. So around 1965, one of the police officers I worked with, he was chosen to take part in one of these two programs. I don't recall which one. And it was fun because certainly we all watched it. And his name was Bryce Fuller. And he was a detective with the Tucson Police Department. And the panel narrowed it down pretty quickly. They realized he was in the criminal justice system, but they had to find out what or where he did it. And they never did. So it turned out his secret was he was a school resource officer, one of the first west of the Mississippi, what we now call an SRO. You know how times change. People were dying to get the SROs into their school, and now they're deciding that the police are a bad influence on the young people, and so many people are now trying to get them out of the SRO. But nevertheless, this is part of my love in secrets. And of course, the big one was Clue. Everybody ever play Clue? Raise your hand if you played Clue at all. A few of you did. Oh, Sandy? Candace, yes. Clue came out right after the Second World War. It actually started in England. And it had a little strange name, Cluedo. C-L-U-E-D-O, Cluedo, or Cluedo, however you would pronounce it. But they got Americanized to Clue. And again, I was a young kid. I was old enough to know better. But I have to tell you how I used to always make my brothers and sister and my parents upset with me. Is I love to say it was Colonel Mustard in the kitchen with the candlestick. Whether it's right or not, didn't make any difference. I was going to solve the mystery. But go back now to Einstein and his comment about imagination. And he made that comment many, many years ago. Much more recently, George C. Olave. Now, the last I've known George, he was on the East Coast writing for the Boston Globe. Pretty progressive writer, so I can't say I follow him very much. But I love what he said. Imagination is only your intelligence having fun. Now take a moment and look at that picture. So the real facts are, it's a little girl and she has a toy cow, period. But in her imagination, look at her. She's in Switzerland, somewhere in the Alps, the cows with the cowbell, all the green pastures, the trees, the mountains. Her imagination is having fun and she's playing the game. And that's what I want to encourage you to do today, is to have some fun with this, with what we're going to do and what you're going to do. Now, probably the greatest imagination of all, has everybody seen The Christmas Story? Been around for, I don't know, 15 or 20 years. And during Christmas time, one of the stations, probably Turner Classic Movies, will show it nonstop for at least 24 hours. And little Ralphie there had quite an imagination. You might remember what his dream was, what he wanted to get. Candace, do you know? She's muted, but I think no. Well, anyway, his dream was, his imagination was to have a Daisy Red Ryder BB gun. And if you've ever seen the movie, if you haven't, you've got to look this Christmas season. There's one scene in there when his imagination is going full tilt and he sees himself in a beautiful cowboy outfit, and mommy and daddy and little sister are hiding under the kitchen table, and the bandits are coming over the back fence. But he's got the BB gun and he's shooting out the window and chasing them away. Wonderful imagination. But he got down to earth in a hurry. One day in school, remember his teacher's name, Mrs. Shields? And he was just going on and on and on about his BB gun. And she said the one word that would just terrify 84th, 5th, 6th graders. She said, children, today we're going to write a theme. Theme. And everybody just panicked. We're going to write a theme? And they started raising their hand and asking all the questions. Well, how wide can our margins be? Can we use all capital letters and all this kind of stuff, trying to get out of it? So today what we're going to do, and I don't know if this was in the sign-up sheet. Did you know you're going to write a theme today? Yeah, we're all going to write a theme. But, think about it. It's going to be a really short story. How about one word or a phrase? If you want to go hog wild, maybe even make it a sentence or so. What we're going to start talking about is your legacy. But here is a word to the wise. Nobody, very, very few people anyway, should ever plan on writing their autobiography. And I've been asked by other people if they could tell me their story and I would write their biography for them. No, I can't do that. I know my story, you know your story, and somebody can't do it for you, but you don't want to write a book. Start with the 3 T's, time, talent, and treasure. To write your autobiography, probably have to commit at least 2 years, if not more. You really have to have the money to do it, to go around and research it. And then you just have to have the impetus, the real nerve to do it and to conduct all that work and carry it on. But if you think of your personal legacy, I don't want you to think about Simon & Schuster or Penguin. I want you to think about yourself, your kids, your grandkids, maybe even those great-great-grandchildren who are not yet born, who at some point could pick up your legacy in a snippet. And let's just talk today on snippets of your history, and then find the most beautiful stories. And if you don't write it, it's never going to be written. Those stories will be lost forever. So let's go in slow motion here and think about this. Think about some of your great accomplishments that you've done in your life, or the reverse of that, failures. Every one of us has had at least one or two good failures that hit us like a brick in the head. But whether it's a great achievement or a failure, in your mind, in your imagination, bring it to life. Who was there? Who did you do it with? Or did you do it alone? What were the rewards for it? What did you learn out of it? Was it family related? Such things as your first kiss, first prom, fell off a horse. Here's my snippet on falling off a horse. I've only fallen off a horse one time. I was about 6 years old. We lived in the outskirts of Kansas City. And behind us was the garden, the creek, and the pasture. And everybody's horses were in the pasture. And all of us little boys in the neighborhood would go over, climb the fence, and go find a horse. We didn't need a saddle or a hackamore. We were little kids. We'd climb up on the horse and hold the mane and ride around for a little while. And one day, going to that pasture, I said, I'm going to ride Sheik. Sheik was a huge, pure white stud. He was the biggest horse. He even looked angry. I don't know if a horse can look angry. He always looked angry. And so we went up to him, and one of his little friends holding an apple. Sheik, good horse, taking it. And another friend boosted me up on Sheik, all probably 50 pounds of me. And I grabbed hold of Sheik's mane. And next thing I knew, I was upside down in front of Sheik's nose, hitting the ground. And I jumped up, mad. Sheik threw me over his head. And then I looked up, my wrist bone was out here. And I screamed, I hollered, and the rest is history. That was the only time I ever fell off a horse. But you tell stories, document stories that are fun for people to know. They can be funny stories. They can be sad stories. I think we may have one person here who has a story about a horse and a broken arm, besides me. I think I see somebody here who has a hilarious story about their wedding day. If I heard that story 1,000 times, I could laugh just as hard. It's one of those days where you say, what else could go wrong? You say, oh yes, what else? But think of things in your lifetime, good, bad, joyful, sad. Think about an era, and we're going through an era right now, 2020. This will be a time that will go down in history books, but every one of us will have a different version of how we dealt with 2020, how 2020 dealt with us. NG2, and we'll come back to that. That's the Noble Generation 2, and that's a series of books. We'll come back to that. But nevertheless, in looking at your own personal life, there's absolutely no end to the topics. It is wide open. If you listen to Cialabi, we listen to Einstein, let your imagination go, let your imagination have fun. And we're going to go here in a few minutes and talk about some of the other ways, some of the methods in which we can document this, because we have all sorts of talents or lack of talent among us. But that doesn't take anything away from our story. Who could give us just a couple of sentences over a bright spot in their life or a sad spot they could share with us? Just any little thing to spike it. Like one of the things you see here on the screen is a funeral. I will never forget the very first funeral I attended, again in Kansas City, Missouri. And our barber was Mr. Drozda. And one afternoon, my parents told me that Mr. Drozda had died, and we're going to the funeral home for the wake. I'd never seen a dead person, and I was not anxious to go see a dead person. Now that happened around 1945, but I can remember it today like it was just yesterday. We went to the funeral home, my whole family, brother, sister, mom, and dad. And I was between mom and dad holding my hands. We walked into the funeral home. You know, the chairs are lined up, the coffin up in front, and the lid open. And I saw Mr. Drozda. This is the funny part. Mr. Drozda had the biggest nose of any human being in the world. And from way back the other end of the room, I could see the casket and Mr. Jones's nose sticking up above the casket. And I'll never forget that. And that took away all the fear I had because I was really afraid to see a dead person. But we have so many things in our life that we can jot down. That's not particularly an awesome thing, but just a little snippet in my life. Something else that I do, you may not do, is every month I write a blog, B-L-O-G. I have a website, thomasjnichols.com, and you can go there, no money, and free, and just read a blog. And it could give you some ideas on things that you might want to write. But trust your imagination. Think about some of the great days you had, days or nights, some of the really hard, sad days that you had. Who can give us a short story? Anybody? Raise your hand or chat there, and Tina or somebody will catch you and let you have the air for a few minutes. We have no takers. Candace, Ed, Jennifer? I see, shake your head. No. This is what teachers go through trying to get kids to talk. But remember, now look at that little girl. Isn't she having fun? She is having a blast on her trampoline. Look at those pigtails. You girls ever have pigtails like that? Jumping up and down, they're flying. But imagination is your intelligence having fun. Different ways to record your legacy. And again, please don't even think about writing an autobiography. Think about a few pages or a few minutes recorded something of an era or an incident or a time. Now, I'm just going to give a snippet of a snippet here, if there is such a thing. This is a letter written by a lady in her 80s. She was a school teacher. And she wrote this letter in 1989 to her two married daughters. Now, the girls had married, gone off, didn't live around mama anymore or anything. And father had died, and all the family for funerals and so forth. But after the funeral, what I call Grammy wrote a letter to the daughters. They said, you knew so much about your daddy, but there's so much that you didn't know. And I want you to know everything about him, of what made him the person that he is, that you've known all your life. And we have that letter written, something you don't see anymore, written in cursive with ink. Don't find that anymore. But here is this beautifully written letter, how the family packed up from the farm in Missouri. Now, I'm from Missouri, but this is not my family. Different part of Missouri, I think. I believe they're down toward Joplin. And they packed up 2 wagons and their oxen because they heard about good farming in the Indian Territory. And they crossed the mountains. When they came to rivers, they had to go to where there was a ferry boat, and they'd have to pay to haul their wagons and their stock across the river. How they were robbed by outlaws, and got to Oklahoma, rented some land, and stayed there for 2 or 3 years, barely made a crop, barely fed themselves, and knew that the Oklahoma Territory, or the Indian Territory, whatever it was called at the time, just wasn't for them. And all this is in this lady's handwritten letter. I would guess she probably spent a better part of a Sunday afternoon writing this letter. And I can't, for us, it's hard to believe. They chartered a railroad boxcar, and they had heard about the good soil and the good water in Melrose, New Mexico. Now, I'm not pro or con Melrose, but I know when we go to Santa Fe from Lubbock, we go west out of Clovis, we come to Melrose about 30 or 40 minutes, have to slow down to 45 miles an hour for about 1 mile, and then we're back on the accelerator and we're off towards Santa Fe. Well, Melrose, New Mexico is where they took the train. And they rented half a section of land. And they stayed 3 years. Hardly made a crop. And of course, they didn't have the communications that we have today. And they heard about the good soil and water in Kittiquay, Texas. They didn't have the money for a train car. They walked. 6 boys, mom and pop. He drove one wagon with oxen pulling it. She drove a wagon with oxen pulling it. The 6 boys walked. They had about half a dozen head of cattle and 1 horse. They walked to Kittiquay, Texas, and the rest is history. But we wouldn't know that story if that lady had not sat down on a Sunday afternoon and written a letter to her daughters. That's a story that would not be in anybody's history book. That is such a personal story. And this is just a snippet of her letter. You read this letter and you can have a heavy heart, but you can also chuckle. I mean, here this lady had to cook dinner every night for the 8 of them, gather together sticks and horse hockeys and cow pies and make a fire and make a dinner for everybody for 2 weeks. And when they ran out of water, if they found a farm, farmers charged a nickel a bucket for water. Great story. So she documented that segment of history with a letter to her daughters. Another method of doing it is Hans. I've known Hans. Hans was born in Germany about 1934, so before the war. And in school, they were heavily indoctrinated with the Nazi propaganda. And they really thought the Nazis and the Germans were great. And Hans was, when he was born, he was orphaned almost immediately, was put into an orphanage. And they don't use the term, I don't think they use the term adopted. He was taken by a family, a very nice family on a farm, I believe in southern Germany, Bavaria, I'm assuming. Now, Hans did not sit down and write this. Hans, eventually in his life, married. He told his stories. He had 3 boys, his wife. From time to time, and not real often, he would tell a story about when he was young. Nobody recorded it. Nobody's taking notes. And I don't know how many of these stories got written down, but I know one son wrote down this portion that I'm reading from, where Hans told the story. And these are his words. The infamous day Hitler declared war and invaded Germany. All churches were ordered to ring their bells. And being a little schoolboy, he was pleased. He thought, oh, how great. Our German army is so wonderful. But when he got home that night for dinner and went in the house, everybody in the house was crying. And Hans didn't understand why. I'm not going to tell you the rest of his story. But this is just a sample of recording your legacy. Again, Hans's story, it's not written in anybody's book. Hans never had it published. He told his stories to his wife and 3 boys when everybody was an adult. Some were noted, such as this one. And the others, I don't know, maybe they would just pass off into history. A third version. If you don't want to write and you don't want to just tell somebody about it, let them do it. Now this one is great. Now if you get closer, maybe you can see Paul. This is a CD called Paul's Interview. Now Paul looks like a pretty crusty old cowboy, and Paul was. He was a cowboy, he was a farmer, and he was a gentleman. I mean, that man had etiquette beyond etiquette. And one day, after he had long retired from the farm, retired from everything, and he's living in Denton, Texas. And this comes from what was then junior high, I guess now middle school. The children were assigned to interview a senior citizen to learn about life in the old days. Now keep in mind, the old days to children is much different than us. You know, I suspect every one of us can tell you exactly where we were and what we're doing when Kennedy was assassinated. But to the young people today, someone have to say, now, was he a president? They don't know anything about it. So much of history is not lost, but people can document their own personal version of history. And it's far better than any history book you can buy. So I've listened to Paul's interview more than once. There are funny things in there that will just make you laugh. And there are sad, heavy, heartwarming stories in his interview. But if you can just imagine a little schoolgirl, she made her appointment, she did everything properly, and she came to Paul's house and they sat down in the living room and she turned on her tape recorder and said, "Now, sir, tell us what it was like." And she would ask him questions. And you listen to it, and it's just, again, there's a history you won't find it in the book. If Paul did not tell that story, that would be lost forever. But Paul's interview will survive. It's not going to be published by Penguin or Simon Schuster, but the family, the heritage behind Paul, and now there's about 4 generations behind him, those stories will live. Questions such as, well, you were a cowboy and a farmer. How many horses did you have? Now, that's a question a child would ask. You have to hear Paul's heavy accented text. Well, sugar, sometimes I had 1 horse and sometimes I had 40 horses. And then he would just go on with his story. But it's such a fabulous story. And between those 3 ways, between the grandmother writing a letter, between the elderly German gentleman telling the story of going through the war, or listening to Paul talk to a young schoolgirl on a Sunday afternoon about what it was like to grow up prior to the Depression, through the war. Fabulous stories. But what I'm trying to hope you can understand is everyone here, and I think that there's close to 20 of us here, everybody has more than one story. We have lots of stories. Please don't focus on an autobiography. They're huge, they're expensive, they're time consuming. And I know a couple of people who have done one, and your audience is maybe 2 or 3 people. You'll get a lot more bang for your buck by doing what I call snippets. Now, another way, and I've reviewed this family record. I talk about time, talent, and treasure to do the family history big time. The lady who did this family history for her mother's side and her father's side of the family, she had the time, the talent, and the treasure, and she used all of them to visit old courthouses, old cemeteries, old churches. She traveled. She documented everything. She dotted the I's and crossed the T's. She wrote a family history that is just unbelievable. You may have one in your family that's already partially written. You may not. Most of us don't. But guess who could start it? Right? Each one of us has the potential of starting that. Names, dates, places of birth, children. Sometimes real treasure troves are found in the box under the bed or in the garage or up in the attic. Old letters, old high school yearbooks. There is just so much available. Certainly DNA. I talked earlier about we're all unique. We have that fingerprint. Nobody else has one like us. DNA can at least set you not only aside individually, but give you a broad background of your ancestors and where they come from. But if we don't do it, nobody's going to do it for us. Earlier, I mentioned the Noble Generation 2. And you can see the names there, Stephen and Joan Neubauer. And I know Steve and Joan. They were in Alpine, now I believe in Georgetown. They're small book publishers. They were approached by Barnes & Noble, Texas, and to conduct a fundraising program to fund adult literacy in Texas. And they did this 3 different times. I was fortunate enough to be invited to take part in Volume 2, which you see the cover of that there. In Volume 2, there's probably about 40 or maybe 50 of us wrote in this book. They didn't want to know our life story. I think the most you could have was 7 pages. I think I have 3 or 4 pages. And we're to write our experience of World War II. And some of those sections of that book are well written, very, very skilled writers. The majority of them are not. They're written just by ordinary people like you and I, who they could tell the story, and they're great stories. They're not ready to go to the publisher. No, and they're not meant to be. They're heartfelt stories of how they remember World War II. My little segment in there, again, as a youngster in Kansas City, Missouri. And there's always been one part stood out to me after all these years have passed. I remember when we go to the movie on Saturday, we see the movie and the serial. Remember those? A lot of cartoons. And it'd be the Movie Tone News, the voice of Ed Herlihy. And I remember World War II, and they would show Tojo on his white mule with his sword. Now here's how World War II affected me seeing that. I would go home and tell my parents, or ask my parents, when Tojo comes to Kansas City, will he chop off my head? That was part of my experience of World War II. Little boy, that's how you see things. But Noble Generation 2 is out there. They're not in the store anymore. You'd have to order them offline or online there somewhere. But there's Volume 1, Volume 2, and Volume 3. But these are short stories that ordinary people like you and I have written about their experience during, and then fill in the blank. Mine was on World War II. If you're so inclined to write your autobiography, I have to tell you, this is great. Larry McMurtry, reading Walter Brennan at the Dairy Queen. How many of you have been up to Archer City? Raise your hand if you've been to Archer City. See a couple, Sandy? No, Candace shaking her head. A lot of you I don't see. I can't get too many of you on my screen here. But Archer City is about an hour east of Seymour. And it has a pretty limited economic base. It has the Dairy Queen, Allsup's, Bookstore 1 and Bookstore 2. And Bookstore 1 and Bookstore 2 are Larry McMurtry's bookstores. If you haven't been there, and I don't have any financial interest in it, but I'd say you'll love it. Go there and talk about the honor system. In Bookstore 2, there are no employees. Just help yourself. There's ladders if you want to climb up and see the books. In Bookstore 1, there's one employee, and she has it like a cashier's cage out of an old bank. And that's the only employee. Just go and help yourself to books and then bring them to the lady and check her out. We were fortunate, my wife and I, last time we were up there, we got our books and went to Bookstore 1 finally and up to the window to pay. And sure enough, guess who was sitting there having a cup of coffee but Larry McMurtry. The odds of ever catching him at home are almost nil, but we did. Got our coffee and had a chance to visit with him. He's not a real outgoing man, but he's very, very pleasant. We talked about his books, and certainly we talked about this one. In fact, I think we bought it right then, Walter Benjamin at the Dairy Queen. But it's Reflections at 60 and Beyond by Larry McMurtry, his life growing up in West Texas. He's rich and famous now, but he wasn't always rich and famous. But anyway, if you're interested in an interesting book, a fun book, and a kind of inside view of West Texas, that is certainly it. Now here's another one. Anne Frank. I think everybody's heard of Anne Frank's diary. A story untold goes to the grave, but a story told may live forever. Now keep in mind, three people we talked about here previously. The lady who wrote the letter was a school teacher. The man who encountered the Germans face-to-face in World War II, he ended up being a mechanical engineer in the Los Angeles area. And Paul the cowboy, from Kittiquay to Denton. We're all ordinary people. We're all ordinary people, but we have stories to tell. If we don't tell our story will go with us. So Anne and her family, they were in hiding in Amsterdam. And as life would have it, they were eventually captured by the Nazis and sent off to the camps. And her mother and her sister did not survive. Mr. Frank did survive. And when the war was all over, he went back to Amsterdam. And has anybody read Anne Frank's diary? Sandy has, yes. Don't see all of you, but yes. But somewhere in her diary, she refers to Kitty, K-I-T-T-Y. I think the line goes something like, Kitty and I are in the corner. So they're in that fourth or fifth store hiding place they're in. She doesn't have a cat, but she has an imagination. Kitty is her diary. So Anne and Kitty are in the corner. And she makes a journal or a diary every day, or almost every day. But it's hard to believe that what she and her family are going through, and look what she said, in spite of everything, I still believe that people are really good at heart. Can you imagine her saying that with what they were going through during the war? But the irony of this all, and again, the value of recording your legacy one way or another somewhere. Mr. Frank returned to Amsterdam after the war. Much to everybody's surprise, he shows up at the door. The same lady still owns the building. She's very warm, kind, glad to see him. And she tells him, well, you know, there wasn't much left after the Germans wiped everything out, but I have some of these papers here that I think your daughter wrote. They're just loose leaf. And you know what that was? It was Anne Frank's diary. And it was published. And the whole world knew of Anne Frank, but not just her, the story of the Jewish people during the war, what they went through. The cost to them, not just in money and stature, but their lives, their way of life. So my encouragement to you is don't let another day go by. Take the time, take the effort. Remember, you're not writing for a great New York publisher. You can write on a yellow scratch pad. You can sit at your word processor and type. But let your imagination have fun. Think of some of the really great things you've encountered in your life, really great obstacles that you've encountered, some of which you may have overcome, some you didn't, but a lesson that was learned, who you met along the way, who has stuck with you thick and thin through the hard times and the good times. Those are the things to put down so that your children and their children and their children can read it or listen to it, just like we have done with these three things here. Now, to be transparent, I'll always be transparent, something else we have to live by in the current era. So the letter, the lady to her children, to her two grown daughters, as my wife's mother wrote that letter. She was a school teacher in Denton. He, Paul, was a little boy that walked from Melrose to Kittiquay with a stick and herding the cattle and keeping them going straight, but who had a very successful farming life. And it's true. Sometimes he had one horse and sometimes he had 40, depending on how the market went. Hans is Hans Bouchell. Hans survived the war, made his way to Switzerland, somehow or other worked his way, got an education as an engineer, made his way to the United States. From there, ventured to California. As I say, the American dream. He started his business and was a fabulous success in his personal and professional life. And our daughter is married to one of Hans' son, Mark. So that's part of our story from our family, but all of you have stories. Ed, do you have a story you could share with us? Just a short snippet? Linda? We have no takers. Candace?
I've got a quick children's story.
Okay.
I was a Cub Scout in Littlefield, and anyway, we used to go over and go to Hemphill Wells, and upstairs they had a scouting department. Well, I fell in love with a hatchet, a Boy Scout hatchet in that store, and I just had to have it. Well, obviously, Mother thought I was too young to have a hatchet. But I think after a year and driving her nuts, I finally got my hatchet for her birthday. Anyway, took it back to Littlefield, and my friend that lived catty-cornered across the street, it was his mother that was a den mother. He came over, and I was so proud. I showed him my hatchet. Well, I guess the thing that intrigued us was we needed to use it. So anyway, we looked around and everything, and went up and down the alley, and couldn't find any just spare wood to chop on. So anyway, I don't know why, but there was a nice big utility pole behind our house. And I chopped on one side, and he chopped on the other side. Well, Mom finally heard all this chopping, and she came out there. And I mean, the world turned over at that point. She was so livid. And when Dad came home, he discovered that he was going to have to buy a new utility pole because we'd done enough damage to that one. So anyway, I lost my hatchet. And it was about 15 years later, and I accidentally came across it, and Dad still wouldn't let me have it.
Well, thanks, Ed, for sharing. Herb, do you have a short story for us? A little snippet?
Oh gosh, this session has generated a lot of memories that I could write about. I could write about my older brother and me playing as a young boy, and he had one of those Red Ryder BB guns that you mentioned a minute ago, and so my grandfather was we lived right next door to my grandfather. In fact, he built the house we lived in and gave it to my father and mother, and then built himself another smaller house on the back part of probably the same property. But anyway, when we would play, he'd get these huge cardboard boxes, corrugated boxes full of, when he got a supply. Did I mention he was a Fuller brush salesman?
Oh, no.
Yeah, he was a Fuller brush salesman in his older age. And so we'd get those big boxes and we'd do all kinds of things with them. And one of the things we'd do, and they were large enough to fit over me when I was about 6 or 7, and he was 4 years older. But so, we'd cut a window in those boxes and put them over us, and we were the monster then. We were the monster, where we would, have holes for our arms and what have you. And the only way that you could kill the monster was to shoot him right between the eyes with this BB gun. And this BB gun, it hadn't had a BB in it for a long, long time. We had used it to cocked it and shoot it and without BBs, cocked it and shoot it without BBs, and on and on. So I was the monster. So I was walking up to him, and he had to shoot me between the eyes. So about a foot away, he had it cocked and he shot me between the eyes. What do you know? It had a BB in it. And the BB And the BB hit me. Fortunately, I guess when he pulled the trigger, he pulled the barrel down but the BB hit me right there on the bone of the eye socket and penetrated, and it was it penetrated in under the skin, started bleeding, and apparently didn't hurt very much. But when I touched up there and the blood, well, yeah, then it really became serious. And I started screaming, and my mother ran out and grabbed me up and took me to a clinic. This is in San Angelo, and anyway, that story is if I hadn't a fraction of an inch higher, and I wouldn't have an eyeball. You know, BB would have penetrated my eyeball. So we had a lot of, as a kid, we played hard, and we had a lot of bumps and skint knees and bicycle wrecks, and during the war, digging trenches. And so you've given me some good ideas to go back and tell my granddaughters or whoever comes on after them, and my daughter probably, because I don't know whether she's ever known. She's heard some of these stories as we've talked about them at the breakfast or the dinner table. And but those are the kind of stories that I guess they'd be interested in. I'd hope they would be interested in, find interesting. My wife has done a couple of things that she's gotten on online and published a book of. It was called Growing Up with Patty, Patty was her younger sister. And it's a marvelous book about that big. And it tells, her story with pictures and all. And then my daughter gave her something that she could buy, gave my wife as a gift. And it was a question that you ask every day about, and my daughter chose the questions to ask. And so that turns, and then my wife had to sit down and think about how to answer that question. And that's a product that you can get. What's the name of that?
Storyworth.
Storyworth.
And it's every Monday.
Yeah, you'd get the question, 52 questions. Yes.
Well, there are so many good stories out there. Everyone has them. And I've written, I will not write an autobiography, but I've written snippets. One called Bye Mama, When I Thought My Mother Gave Me Away. Yeah, how a little boy's brain works. But there are so many stories, and the ones I've shared with you, they're true stories, and written by wonderful people, but they've passed them down now for generations to generations. And that's what I want to encourage you to do is when we go to the grave, we take our stories with us. But in the meantime, one means or another, let's document them, tell them to somebody, write them down, record them, whatever it is. So do we have any questions, any thoughts?
Let me repeat that about Storyworth, because that structures it for you, and you buy the product, and and not having done it myself, I can't give you all, but it's a structured way to do what you're talking about, Tom.
Okay, good.
And Storyworth, and you could look that up on the internet or somewhere, because it's an available product to guide you through this.
Okay.
How do you spell that?
I guess it's Gail. Well, she's gone now. It's whether it's one word or two, I don't know, but Storyworth.
W-O-R-T-H or words? Or
W-O-R-T-H.
Okay.
Storyworth. Okay. Well, thank you, Herb. Appreciate it. Appreciate the story. Ed, we always love your stories. You always have, you're a library waiting to be written. So, Jane, get him to work there. Any other comments or questions?
By the way, I've been in Cudahy. Spent the night there for the Bob Wills Festival over in
Yeah, Turkey.
Turkey, Texas. Yeah.
Meryl, do you have a question?
Yes, I do, Mr. Nichols. Thank you. So I am actually in the process of doing a photo album for my family that goes back to when we were little to the present time. And I'm trying to add in little snippets as you talked about. Do you think there are some that carry forward more than others? Most of the stories the gentlemen have shared have been more funny stories, but what do you think is best for a grandchild that, you know, you may not be around when that child starts asking? How does that carry forward in the years to come?
Well, just using the three that I referenced in the presentation, there were funny stories in there, but there were some truly sad, heartwarming stories, and they do carry forward. I mean, you know, at the time that the incident happened, things happen beyond our control. We just have to deal with it, and people can second guess us forever. But we did what we did or didn't do, and we documented the way we saw it and the way it was in our eyes. And the story by Hans particularly is very, very moving. Part of his story is when there were Germans everywhere and the Allied bombers were everywhere and their home was bombed. And he ran to the house and somebody said, save whatever you can get. And he ran in and he grabbed his accordion and got out. He loved his accordion. But I heard him talk years later. How selfish of me to only get my accordion and not get something else. But it was a true story. It's what.
Okay, thank you.
Tom, what do you think about obituaries? About, you know, along with your life story or your family's life story, about that would seem to me to be perhaps a pretty good source.
I think so, and maybe because we're that age now, we read obituaries almost every day. Most of them are just pure facts: born, died, where they worked, and the end of the story. But some of them are beautifully written. Somebody really put time and effort into them. And so, Herb, what you're saying there, that is an excellent idea. Is the forethought that goes into writing an obituary, which I don't want to make this all dark and sad, but my wife and I have teamwork. We have written our obituaries. So it's more of a story of our life, just than the cold hard facts: born, died, worked at so-and-so. We've made it a story. And so obituaries are a valuable source for recording your own, but also for finding others. Anyone else? Any comments? Any questions? Yes, Marie.
Okay, if you look on my screen behind me there, you'll see what the story is that I have, or stories that I have started. And it was growing up on a farm in southern Wisconsin. And many of those items that are on that wall there, I have kept through the years, and hopefully somebody of my grandkids or whatever will want to keep some of those. But that sign up there of 1935 is the sign that was on the barn the year it was built. And the mirror there was actually one of the stanchions that came out of the barn, and various other things that are on the wall are things that came from the farm. And I got a ways on there, but I've made some notes now of some other little stories that I need to be adding, and I'm far from done. But anyhow, it's going to be a combination of story and pictures of these various things that describe, because a lot of people look at this thing on the wall hanging here with the mirror and they don't have a clue what it is, so I have to explain what a stanchion is.
Right.
And so anyhow, I've started, But yes, it takes a while to get these things put together and done, but
Well, it's a lot of work.
working on it.
A lot of work. Thank you, Marie. Appreciate your input. And Candace, I know that you're a writer, and certainly take some of your time, some of your talent, and
Tom, I'm sorry I couldn't figure out how to turn the mute off. I just did. I've been sitting here going, wait.
well, anyway, Candace, I know that you're a writer, and you specialize in children's literature. But take some of your time. Now you're retired, and think of some of those high points, even the low points in your life, and tell that story to the generations to come to share them, just like we've shared on these three people that we shared here today, and that
there's
Herb, Merrill, and so forth have shared with us. And Ed is a walking library of stories.
it sounds like it.
Jane has to put up with him though. So.
Yep.
Okay,
When are you going to share your stories?
well, some things I do. Of course, I've published one or two in Noble Generation, and I've had one published in a magazine, and some others I've just written and really done nothing with. Ed, I have one. The very first thing I ever wrote was a one-page, shortly after our children were married, one page on Christmas Now. Our first Christmas without kids in the house, just a one page. But I've written on different stages of my life. And of course, and I write a monthly blog. And so I invite y'all to go. It's free, www.thomasjnichols.com. And my blog is there, free, and just whatever I write. Generally, a blog is about 400 to 500 words, so easy to read. Try to not have too many multisyllabic words. So.
Don't make fun of us now.
Yeah, right. Thank you. Well, I want to thank all of you for sharing your evening time with us. And I've had fun. I hope you've had fun. But more than anything else, before you go to bed tonight, at least write a couple of lines that will at least spike your day for tomorrow to sit down and actually do a little something. So I want to thank you very much. And Tina or whomever else is there at the fort holding down the fort. I'm not at the fort. I'm about